You're looking to cut through the noise, right? Get straight to the point and really understand something without getting bogged down.
Exactly. That's what we aim for.
So today, we're zeroing in on a really fascinating bit of New York City history. The Savage Skulls. They were a street gang, started in the Bronx, way back in 1969.
And we're mainly looking at their Wikipedia entry for this deep dive. You might think, oh, just Wikipedia, but there's actually a surprisingly rich story packed in there.
Absolutely. So our mission today is just to pull out the most significant, the most intriguing parts of the Savage Skull story, based purely on what this source tells us.
Sounds good.
Okay, so where does this story actually begin for the Savage Skulls, according to the entry?
Right. So it says they got started December 12th, 1969, and the location was Hunts Point in the Bronx.
Late 69. That era in New York. Lots of upheaval, lots of change. Must have played a role, right?
Oh, undoubtedly. It was a specific kind of environment back then. The source also mentions who was involved.
Yeah, it says mostly Puerto Rican and African American. That tells you something about the community right away.
Definitely. It really highlights the demographics of Hunts Point at that time,
Yeah.
Communities dealing with very specific social, economic challenges.
And it notes they were active from 69 right up to the present day.
Yeah, which is, well, it's a remarkably long time for any group like that to stick around.
Hunts Point, that specific place, became their territory. It's interesting how tied a group can get to one location.
It really is. A gang's turf isn't just like physical space. It's about identity, belonging, resources.
And, yeah, potential for conflict, too, unfortunately.
Exactly. Which brings us to some of their key activities mentioned in the source.
Right. It says early 70s, they declared war on the drug dealers operating in the Hunts Point area. That's a pretty bold move.
It really is. You have to wonder what was behind that. Was it like a turf thing? A moral stand, maybe a mix?
Yeah, like trying to assert their own control, or maybe genuinely reacting to the damage drugs were doing.
It suggests something more complex than just, gang activity. The source doesn't really spell out how that war went, but it hints at some complicated dynamics.
And it wasn't just drug dealers they clashed with.
No, definitely not. There were running battles with rival gangs. The source names the Seven Immortals, the Savage Nomads, and the Dirty Dozen.
Wow. That paints a picture of a really volatile environment.
Yeah.
Constant tension.
For sure. It just underlines that competitive landscape, Groups fighting for influence, for space, for respect. Each of those names probably has its own whole story.
Now, this is where it kind of breaks out into wider attention, doesn't it? The gang was actually photographed in 1972.
Yeah, by Jean-Pierre Lafont. That's significant. Having a photographer document them, it makes them visible in a different way.
It gives you a real visual connection, right?
Yeah.
To that specific time and place.
Exactly. And the source even links to some of his photos. There's also a mention of a 2015 article about Lafont's work, emphasizing how impactful those images were.
And then, moving beyond still photos, they were the subject of a whole documentary film in 1979, 80 Blocks from Tiffany's.
That title.
Yeah, 80 Blocks from Tiffany's. It creates such a stark contrast, doesn't it? What does that juxtaposition signal?
I mean, it just screams about the huge social and economic gaps in the city back then. The South Bronx versus like affluent midtown Manhattan.
Worlds apart.
Totally. And the film, directed by Gary Weiss, it clearly made an impression. It's referenced multiple times in our source material. There's a link to Dangerous Minds talking about it.
And it even has an entry in the All-Movie database that suggests it has some standing, within documentary film history.
Right. And apparently the director Gary Weiss even talked about it again years later in a 2010 Black Book magazine piece.
So the film clearly had legs. It endured. Why do you think their story, captured like that, resonated so much?
Well, I think all that media attention, the photos, the film, it points to a broader societal interest, maybe fascination, maybe concern about these communities and gang life itself.
Kind of a window into a world most people didn't see.
Exactly. A world often invisible to the mainstream.
The source also names a leader, Felipe Mercado. What role does a leader play in a group like this?
But leadership's always crucial, right?
Yeah.
In a gang context, the leader often sets the tone, makes the big calls, really shapes the group's identity and actions.
And Mercado is mentioned again later.
Yeah, in a 1997 New York Times article by David Gonzalez, it talks about former gang members, including Mercado, so it gives a hint about, what happened to some of these guys later on.
Okay, now, we need to talk about one of the most striking parts mentioned in the source, the Nazi symbolism.
Yeah, that is jarring. It says they, and also the Savage Nomads apparently, use swastikas. even Nazi helmets.
It's hard to wrap your head around. A street gang in the Bronx using that imagery? What could possibly be the intention?
The source is pretty explicit. It says the purpose was to project how menacing and terrible they were.
So, pure intimidation, using the most extreme symbols they could think of.
Seems like it. A really deliberate, though obviously deeply disturbing, choice meant to shock, instill fear, demand respect, maybe? It makes you wonder how much they understood the history versus just using the image.
And it went beyond just symbols, right? Didn't they have a position called Gestapo?
Yeah, that's mentioned too. A direct reference to Nazi Germany's secret police. That's chilling.
What does adopting a term like that suggest about their internal structure or just the image they wanted?
It really raises questions, doesn't it? Were they fully aware of the horrific history tied to the Gestapo? Or was it more about cultivating this image of, like, ruthless internal authority? The source doesn't go that deep, but it's a stark detail.
The entry also drops a few other names in connection with the Savage Skulls.
Yeah.
Universal Zulu Nation, Black Spades, Julio 204.
What might those connections indicate?
Well, they probably point to a wider network, right?
Mm.
Other groups, key figures operating in the same kind of social cultural space in New York at the time.
Yeah, you could probably trace a whole web of connections there, understand the broader landscape of these subcultures.
So, okay, we've touched on their origins, their turf
Mm.
in Hunts Point, those conflicts with drug dealers and rivals, the media spotlight, LaFont's photos, the documentary.
Their leadership under Felipe Mercado, and then this really unsettling use of Nazi imagery.
Right. It gives us a definite snapshot, even if it's based on just this one source.
It does. The Wikipedia entry pulls together a lot of key threads, gives you links, references. It's a solid starting point if you wanted to dig even deeper into this specific slice of Bronx history.
Okay, so stepping back from the details of this deep dive, what are the main things that really jump out? What's the core takeaway for someone listening?
For me, it's that complex mix. You've got the local identity, the turf wars, but layered on top is that incredibly disturbing choice of symbolism. A Bronx street gang in the 70s using Nazi imagery to project menace. That contrast is really stark.
Yeah, that's the real aha moment for me, too. It wasn't just, generic gang stuff. This specific conscious choice to use swastikas, the Gestapo title, it's just a chilling example of how symbols, even the most horrific ones, can be sort of twisted and repurposed.
Given new localized meanings in different contexts for very specific disturbing goals, like projecting ultimate fear.
It forces you to think about how power gets negotiated, right? Especially in places where maybe traditional authority feels distant or irrelevant.
Definitely. How groups assert themselves, claim space, demand attention, sometimes in really shocking ways.
So for our listener, thinking about the Savage Skulls, their story, the way they were documented in photos and film, what does it tell us about how gang life was perceived back then versus maybe what the reality was on the ground?
And maybe what kind of lasting impact do those kinds of narratives, those images have? How do they shape our understanding even now?
Yeah, it's definitely something to chew on long after this deep dive ends. How are these stories told? Who tells them? And what do they reveal about the time, the place, and maybe even ourselves?
Absolutely. It makes you think critically about the sources themselves and the broader societal context that produced both the gangs and the stories about them.